morning. Are you ready for our next Heritage Studies lesson? We're going to be on lesson 14. And there's going to be some words in here that are kind of hard words, hard to pronounce maybe, words that you don't know, new words coming up here. So I'd like for you to look on page 45 in your book. And let's look at the title of this section. Remember yesterday we talked about changes during the Reconstruction, lots of different changes in lots of different parts of American life. Mostly in the South is where most of the changes took place. Look at page 45. Today's lesson is going to be talking about the problems during the Reconstruction. And right underneath where it says that, there's a word there. Do you know what that word says? Corruption. Do you know what corruption means? Corruption is dishonesty. That's what that is. Let's see if there's another word. I think there's another word in here on these pages that we were going to look at. It might be hard to know. No, I don't think so. All right, let's look at page 45. There's a picture on there. This picture is actually called a political cartoon. And there's still political cartoons today. A cartoon is something that is a picture that is drawn, like a drawing that is fictional. It's not real. A lot of times it'll be kind of funny looking, but it's actually meant to make a political point. So this picture is a political cartoon by a very famous political cartoonist named was Thomas Nast. He was actually born, I think, in Germany, and he came to America when he was 6, and he studied art. And he was the one actually. I don't know if you know this, but the two main political parties that we have today, the Republicans and the Democrats, they each have an animal that represents them. It's a symbol that represents the elephant and the donkey. And he's the one that actually came up with that. So let's look at the top of page 45 and let's learn what corruption was going on during the Reconstruction period. Besides the division in Southern society, there were other problems during the Reconstruction. Remember, one of those problems we talked about at the end of yesterday's lesson was segregation, where the society was beginning to split in two. Some of the biggest problems were corruption, violence, and finding jobs for the freedmen. During the Reconstruction time, both the North and the South suffered from corruption or dishonesty in government. Corruption occurs when people use their influence, their authority, their power to help themselves instead of doing their job and helping other people. One example of corruption happened in the Midwest. There were some tax collectors that were sent, and they only sent half the money back to the government. And the rest of what they collected, they kept for themselves. That is corruption. Many Southerners claimed that corruption was the Republicans' fault. In 1868, America elected a new president, Ulysses S. Grant. He had been a successful general during the Civil War. He was also a Republican. Many of his friends in the government were corrupt, but the president himself was not corrupt. Can you turn the page? There's another political cartoon there on page 48. You see that this one's really weird. And this is by the same man, Thomas Nast. In the South, several state lawmakers were corrupt. Sometimes these lawmakers took bribes. A bribe is a gift of money or favor to cause someone to make a decision. For example, many southern states built railroads after the war. The owner of a railroad company might bribe state lawmakers to let his company build the tracks, but some companies didn't finish the job. Then the state had to pay to finish the work. Corruption hurt the states. There was also a lot of corruption in the North. In New York City, a small group of men tried to control the entire city. They wanted people to pay them money. And in return, the men said that they would vote in favor of certain laws and building projects that the people wanted. This was not an honest way to vote. America suffered from that corruption. Most Americans opposed corruption. That man, Thomas Nast, drew pictures that made fun of corrupt people, like this picture right here on page 46. He was making fun of, he was poking fun at them. When newspapers printed his pictures, people learned about the corruption, and over time, Americans passed new laws to help stop corrupt behavior. So those political cartoons, I would say, were probably quite helpful, weren't they? Let's look at page 47. Now this is the other part of the problems. One problem was corruption. Another was a lot of violence took place during this time. Violence became another major problem during the Reconstruction. In the South, white people did not like the freedmen to act as if they were equal with them. Most white Southerners didn't want black people to vote. They wanted black people to obey white people. And to make this happen, some white people began groups to threaten and hurt the freedmen. The most infamous group was the Ku Klux Klan. Infamous means being known for doing wrong or bad things. Bad white men hurt freedmen to stop them from voting. Now I'm going to stop right there just for a second. Now notice that this said bad white men. This was not all white men. This was some that were bad that started to do this. Enemies of freedmen's voting rights sometimes blocked black people from voting. They beat or shot the black men who tried to vote. Sometimes these men went to freedmen's houses at night. They would burn crosses in their yards, and even they'd burn their houses sometimes. Freedmen often had to hide to be safe and to keep their families safe. For a while, Northern Army officers protected the freedmen. As long as the Northern Army was in a southern state, the Freedmen's Bureau told the Army about the problems there. But as Reconstruction started to come to a close, it started ending, problems got worse. When a Northern Army left a southern state, the white men there threatened and killed freedmen. By the end of Reconstruction, many freedmen stopped voting. Even though the 15th Amendment promised them the right to vote, voting had just become too dangerous for them. Look at that painting there on page 47. Some former Confederate soldiers formed a secret group called the Ku Klux Klan. They tried to scare freedmen to keep them from voting because they voted differently than the white men. Because remember, some of the government was corrupt, and so they didn't want people voting if it was going to mess up their corruption, what was going on there. All right, look at the next page. Here's some more issues that were going on during this time. Remember, it said that there was corruption in the government, both in the North and the South. And then there was violence that was going on. And there were also no jobs for the freedmen. Remember, these guys were free. They wanted to work. Remember, we learned that. They wanted to go to work, but they were having trouble finding jobs. Let's look at page 48, and we're going to find out why they were having trouble finding a job. Finding work for the freedmen was another major problem. Before the Civil War, the South had few factories. But after most Southerners expected to continue to make a living by growing crops, many of those freedmen hoped to become independent farmers. They believed the government would give each family land and a mule. Freedmen hoped that the national government would take land from Confederate leaders who owned large plantations. These freedmen hoped the land would be divided among those who used to be slaves there. Many freedmen believed that since they and their ancestors had helped build the plantations, that they might receive some of the land. White Southerners viewed the land and work differently. They believed the land belonged to them. Even though the slaves had been freed, white Southerners didn't think the freedmen should get the land. Many Southerners thought most freedmen were lazy. White Southerners wanted to force freedmen to work on the white people's plantations. In other words, there were some of those bad white Southerners that wanted to bring slavery back. The national government didn't give either side what they wanted. Only some freedmen were given land. The government said that it couldn't take the people's land. Land was only taken from landowners if they didn't pay their taxes. However, the government did not let Southern white people force the freedmen to work. When Southern states passed laws that required the freedmen to work, the national government said the laws were illegal. Look at the top of page 49. Eventually, the South developed a way to grow crops. This system was called sharecropping. Landowners allowed poor white and black farmers to rent plots of land. In return, the farmer gave the landowner a share of the crops. A farming family might borrow money to buy seeds and farm tools, and when the crop was harvested, they had to pay back their landlord and pay him rent. Few poor Southerners made much money sharecropping. They ended up owing lots of money to their landlords. The system of sharecropping lasted in the South for many decades. Do you know how long a decade is? It's a period of 10 years. That's right. So let's look at this diagram at the bottom of page 49. Just notice the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Check out number 1. It says the farmer would rent the land in exchange for a share of the crops. And then what happened second? The farmer would borrow money to buy what he needed. And then thirdly, the farmer would plant and harvest the crops. The next thing that happened would the farmer then would share his harvest and he would repay the debt. The fifth thing was that the farmer usually owed more than he could pay. The last thing that happened was the farmer promised to share more and repay more the next time. So oftentimes he would dig himself into a hole and he couldn't get out. It was a way of, almost a way of slavery again, both for poor whites and poor blacks. They were just working to live, basically, is what they were doing. Now, your assignment today on page 21 is to actually draw a political cartoon about something that you've learned. Now, I'm not going to make you do this page. This is optional because sometimes people like to draw and sometimes I can't draw. I have trouble drawing stick people. So if you want to draw this, you can. I'm not going to grade it. If you do it, I may grade it. If you don't, that's okay. I'm going to leave page 21 to be optional for you, okay? All right, that will conclude your lesson for today.